Section 25, page 123. After the door had closed again, Arthur continued to look at her with bitter eyes. Why the sacrifice? Since you tell me that you are lovely, I have no right to keep you from your friends. She smiled a little under her wet lashes. I shan't be lonely now. I was lonely. I was afraid. But the emptiness and the darkness are gone. When I turn back into myself now, I am like a child going at night into a room where there is always a light. Her tone and her look still enveloped her as soft inaccessibility. And Arthur groaned out again. I don't understand you. Yet you understand me. He reddened under the retort, but kept his eyes on her. May is ready to give me up. What, 3 days after you entreated her on your knees to hasten your marriage? She's refused. That gives me the right. Ah, you have taught me what an ugly word that is, she said. He turned away with a sense of utter weariness. He felt as though he had been struggling for hours up the face of a steep precipice, and now, just as he had fought his way to the top, his hold had given way and he was pitching down headlong into darkness. If he could have got her in his arms again, he might have swept away her arguments, but she still held him at a distance by something inscrutably aloof in her look and attitude, and by his own awed sense of her sincerity. At length he began to plead again. If we do this now, it will be worse afterward. Worse for everyone. No, 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 she almost screamed, as if he frightened her. At that moment, the bell sent a long tingle through the house. They had heard no carriage stopping at the door, and they stood motionless, looking at each other with startled eyes. Outside, Nastasia's step crossed the hall, the outer door opened, and a moment later she came in carrying a telegram, which she handed to the Countess Olenska. The lady was very happy at the flowers, Nastasia said, smoothing her apron. She thought it was her senior Marito who had sent them, and she cried a little and said it was a folly. Her mistress smiled and took the yellow envelope. She tore it open and carried it to the lamp. Then, when the door had closed again, she handed the telegram to Arthur. It was dated from the St. Augustine and addressed to the Countess Olenska. In it he read, Granny's telegram was successful. Papa and Mama agree marriage after Easter. I am telegraphing Newland. I'm too happy for words and love you dearly. Your grateful May. Half an hour later, when Arthur unlocked his own front door, he found a similar envelope on the hall table on top of his pile of notes and letters. The message inside the envelope was also from May Welland, and ran as follows. Parents' consent wedding Tuesday after Easter at 12, Grace Church, 8 bridesmaids, please see rector. So happy love May. Arthur crumpled up the yellow sheets as if the gesture could annihilate the news it contained. Then he pulled out a small pocket diary and turned over the pages with trembling fingers. But he didn't find what he wanted, and cramming the telegram into his pocket, he mounted the stairs. A light was shining through the door of the little hall room, which served Janie as a dressing room and boudoir, and her brother rapped impatiently on the panel. The door opened, and his sister stood before him in her immemorial purple flannel dressing gown, with her hair on pins. Her face looked pale and apprehensive. Newland, I hope there is no bad news in that telegram. I waited on purpose, in case, in parentheses, no item of his correspondence was safe from Janie. He took no notice of her question. Look here, what day is Easter this year? She looked shocked at such unchristian ignorance. Easter, Newland? Why, of course, the first week in April. Why? The first week? He turned again to the pages of his diary, calculating rapidly under his breath. The first week, did you say? He threw back his head with a long laugh. For mercy's sake, what's the matter? Nothing's the matter, except that I am going to be married in a month. Jenny fell upon his neck and pressed him to her purple flannel breasts. Oh, Newland, how wonderful! I am so glad, but, dearest, why do you keep on laughing? Do hush, or you will make Mamma. Book 2, Chapter 19. The day was fresh, with a lively spring wind full of dust. All of the old ladies in both families had got out their faded sables and yellowing ermines, and the smell of camphor from the front pews almost smothered the faint spring scent of the lilies banking the altar. Newland Archer, at a signal from the sexton, had come out of the vestry and placed himself with his best man on the chancel step of Grace Church. The signal meant that the brougham bearing the bride and her father was in sight, but there was sure to be a considerable interval of adjustment and consultation in the lobby, where the bridesmaids were already hovering like a cluster of Easter blossoms. During this unavoidable lapse of time in the bridegroom, in proof of his eagerness, was expected to expose himself alone to the gaze of the assembled company. And Archer had gone through his formality as resignedly as through all the others, which made of a 19th century New York wedding a rite that seemed to belong to the dawn of history. Everything was equally easy, or equally painful. As one of chose to put it, in the path he was committed to tread, and he had obeyed the flurried injunctions of his best man as piously as other bridegrooms had obeyed his own, in the days when he had guided them through the same labyrinth. So far he was reasonably sure of having fulfilled all his obligations. The bridesmaids' 8 bouquets of white lilac and lilies of the valley had been sent in due time, as well as the gold and sapphire sleeve-links of the 8 ushers, and the best man's cat's eye scarf pin. Archer had sat up half of the night trying to vary the wording of his thanks for the last batch of presents from man friends and ex-lady loves. The fees for the bishop and the rector were safely in the pocket of his best man. His own luggage was already at Mrs. Manson Mingott's, where the wedding breakfast was to take place. And so were the travelling clothes into which he was to change, and a private compartment had been engaged in the train that was to carry the young couple to their unknown destination. Concealment of the spot in which the bridal night was to be spent being one of the most sacred taboos of the prehistoric ritual. "Got the ring all right," whispered young van der Luyden Newland, who was inexperienced in the duties of a best man, and awed by the weight of his responsibility. Archer made the gesture we had seen so many bridegrooms make. With his ungloved right hand, he felt in the pocket of his dark grey waistcoat, and assured himself that the little gold circlet, in parentheses, engraved inside, Newland to May, April 1870, was in its place. Then, resuming his former attitude, his tall hat and pearl grey gloves with black stitchings grasped in his left hand, he stood looking at the door of the church. Overheard, Handel's march swelled pompously through the imitation stone vaulting, carrying on its waves the faded rift of the many weddings at which, with cheerful indifference, he had stood on the same chancel step watching other brides float up the nave toward other bridegrooms. How like a first night at the opera, he thought, recognizing all the same faces in the same boxes, in parentheses, no, peeves. I'm wondering if, when the last trump sounded, Mrs. Selfridge Mary will be there with the same towering ostrich feathers in her bonnet, and Mrs. Beaufort with the same diamond earrings and the same smile, and whether suitable proscenium seats were already prepared for them in another world. After that, there was still time to review, one by one, the familiar countenances in the first rows, the woman's sharp with curiosity and excitement, the man sulky with the obligation of having to put on their frock coats before luncheon, and fight for the food at the wedding breakfast. Too bad the breakfast is at all Catherine's. The bridegroom could fancy Reggie, she was saying. But I am told that Lovell Mingott insisted on its being cooked by his own chef, so it ought to be good if one can only get it at. And he could imagine Sillerton Jackson adding with authority, "My dear fellow, haven't you heard? It is to be served at small tables, in the new English fashion." Archer's eyes lingered on a moment on the left-hand pew, where his mother, who had entered the church on Mr. Henry van der Luyden's arm, sat weeping softly under her Chantilly veil, her hands in her grandmother's ermine muff. Poor Janie, he thought, looking at his sister, even by screwing her head around she can see only the people in the few front pews, and they are mostly dowdy Newlands and Dagonets. On the hither side of the white ribbon dividing off the seats reserved for the families he saw Beaufort, tall and red-faced, scrutinizing the woman with his arrogant stare. Beside him sat his wife, all silvery chinchilla and violets, and on the far side of the ribbon, Lawrence Lefferts' sleekly brushed head seemed to mount guard over the invisible deity of good form, who presided at the ceremony. Archer wondered how many flaws Lefferts' keen eyes would discover in the ritual of his divinity. Then he suddenly recalled that he too had once thought such questions important. The things that had filled his days seemed now like a nursery parody of life, or like the wrangles of medieval schoolmen over metaphysical terms that nobody had ever understood. A stormy discussion as to whether the wedding presents should be shown had darkened the last hours before the wedding, and it seemed inconceivable to Archer that grown-up people should work themselves into a state of agitation over such trifles, and that the matter should have been decided, in parentheses, in the negative, by Mrs. Welland, saying, with indignant tears, "I should as soon turn the reporters loose in my house." Yet there was a time when Archer had a definite and rather aggressive opinions on all such problems, and when everything concerning the manners and customs of his little tribe had seemed to him fraught with the worldwide significance. And all the while, I suppose, he thought, real people were living somewhere, and real things happening to them. "There they come," breathed the best man excitedly. But the bridegroom knew better. The cautious opening of the door of the church meant only that Mr. Brown, the livery stable keeper, in parentheses, gowned in black in his intermittent character of sexton, was taking a preliminary survey of the scene before marshalling his forces. The door was softly shut again. Then, after another interval, it swung majestically open, and a murmur ran through the church. "The family!" Mrs. Welland came first, on the arm of her eldest son. Her large, pink face was appropriately solemn, and her plum-colored satin with pale blue-sided panels and blue ostrich plumes in a small satin bonnet met with a general approval. But before she had settled herself with a stately rustle, in the pew opposite Mrs. Archer's, the spectators were craning their necks to see who was coming after her. While rumors had been abroad the day before to the effect that Mrs. Manson Mingott, in spite of her physical disabilities, had resolved on being present at the ceremony. And the idea was so much in keeping with her sporting character that bets run high at the clubs as to her being able to walk up the nave and squeeze into a seat. It was known that she had insisted on sending her own carpenter to look into the possibility of taking down the end panel of the front pew and to measure the space between the seat and the front. But the result had been discouraging, and for one anxious day her family had watched her dallying with the plan of being wheeled up the nave in her enormous bed chair and sitting enthroned in it at the foot of the channel. End of the section, page 128.